You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Once again, here it comes. The torch will light the Olympic flame in a France mired in political fights, in a Paris that rejoiced when the Games were awarded a long time ago, and now, if you watch the coverage coming out of the City of Light, seems resigned rather than excited about the sprawling international spectacle. Richard Deitsch is a media reporter for The Athletic and host of the podcast Sports Media with Richard Deitsch. Richard has covered 7 Olympic Games in his career. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Great to be with you, Ray.
Paris has been getting ready for this for a long time. What will we see when the Games open?
You know, for one thing, we're going to see a city that people identify with, that people romanticize. And we're going to see an Olympics for the first time in a couple of years that feels like the Olympics. Crowds will be back. I think there's global excitement in seeing these athletes compete in what we traditionally think of the Olympics, again, with no restrictions. And the city of Paris in itself, obviously it's one of the world's great cities. But the backdrops of the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe, or the opening ceremony, when literally the athletes of the world are going to parade down the River Seine, that's something that's never been done before. These Olympics, at least in terms of broad strokes, really has a chance to reimagine what the Olympic Games can be. Because the Games have struggled in the last couple of years, some self-inflicted, but then obviously others just impacted by the events of the world.
There are so many interesting storylines running through France right now. Its domestic situation, the relative popularity or unpopularity of Emmanuel Macron, the president, his pledge, which seems to be coming true, to have Notre Dame, one of the world's great attractions, reopened in time for the world to come in for the game. And the Tour de France will be ending on the Champs-Élysées right around the time the Olympics are starting. It's like the 4th of July and Christmas Eve and New Year's all in one.
Well, Ray, you never can forget that the Olympics, in many ways at their core, they're a marketing opportunity or a marketing vehicle for the city. Now, the city of Paris doesn't need more public relations or hype. People know the city of Paris. But never forget that this is a very, very big, in some ways, propaganda tool for the current government that exists in a country. And so for Macron, there's no doubt you will see him everywhere during these games. He's going to try to get as much, I would assume, photo ops as he can. Because by and large, unless something bad happens, it's usually a very good marketing tool for any politician to be part of. Now, large question, is it ultimately good for the citizens of a country? Is it ultimately good for the people once the party goes away? I think, generally speaking, no, because a lot of times the expenditure of the Olympics is so great that it puts countries in the hole. But during those 3 weeks, it's an absolute party for the host country. And you will see, I think, France in many ways overjoyed that the world has come to them and is seeing all of its splendor and beauty.
Given what you just alluded to, has the world's thinking collectively changed about what you're taking on? Are Olympic bids now the ego, the vanity plays of authoritarian leaders more than the considered decision of a democratic polity?
Yeah, it's a combination of both. We're coming off a cycle where autocratic countries have hosted the games, essentially making these over-the-top bids to the IOC. And the IOC, of course, looks the other way in terms of human rights and all that stuff. That's sort of a tradition with that particular body. The current Olympic cycle is interesting in that we're now heading towards Olympics that are in more, democratic-oriented places. Obviously, we have Paris here. We have Los Angeles coming up in the cycle. We have Cortina Milan coming up in the cycle, although Italy obviously just shifted right, so we'll sort of see what happens there. Brisbane is coming up eventually. That's a very different cycle, Ray, than, Beijing or Sochi. The real issue when it comes to this stuff is the cost is so prohibitive that if you put the vote up to the public at all, it's very hard to get the public behind this once they sort of see the expenditures, because generally speaking, the public doesn't really benefit from this the way the leadership of a government might. They're not the ones who are experiencing the partying for 3 weeks. Maybe it helps them get temporary jobs. But in many ways, and again, I'm someone who loves the Olympics, but I'm very clear-eyed about it. The Olympics and the IOC always make the oversell in terms of how much this is going to stimulate the economy. It rarely does. What it can do is it can leave infrastructure, which is very valuable, creating new trains or transit system or something like that. But by and large, these countries spend billions of dollars on stadiums and they become white elephants. They're not used for anything other than the Olympic Games. That's generally why the IOC has gone to, I think, authoritarian countries, because they know the stuff will get done and they know money will be invested, obviously, because the people don't have a say. So this little cycle is interesting, particularly for an American audience. Los Angeles, one, will see if they can make any money on it, but two, it's a grand spectacle of sports in the United States, and we haven't had a U.S. Summer Olympic Games in some time.
Lest we forget, there's actually going to be top-level sport going on from a fan's perspective, or that of a viewer who only pays attention to some of these sports once every 4 years. What's on tap? A good Olympics, it looks like?
I would say potentially a great Olympics, not just good. The one thing that's very good, if we want to make this a U.S.-centric focus, the United States has some built-in stars coming into the games. That's huge for NBC/Comcast/Peacock, who are the broadcasters of this. And it's really huge for the American public, who has already identified some of these people and will be anticipating watching them. Simone Biles is sort of the perfect example of this. World's greatest gymnast who will be competing in Paris. She'll be destination viewing for people. In track and field, you have stars who have now existed for the last couple of years, like Noah Lyles, Sha'Carri Richardson. While not as famous, let's say, as LeBron James or something like that, these are people who've competed in Olympics. I think the casual sports fan knows that these are people that they should figure out when to tune in and watch. And it's the same thing in swimming. Katie Ledecky is somebody who I think Americans know as one of the great swimmers of all time. So she becomes destination viewing. And then if we hit up a couple of the team sports, the United States basketball team between LeBron James and Joel Embiid and Anthony Davis and Steph Curry, I mean, it's essentially a Hall of Fame group who are playing. Not to mention some of the other countries like Canada also have all NBA players. And then obviously the women's basketball tournament, whether it's Asia Wilson or Diana Taurasi, again, household names in these sports. To me, the best thing about the Olympics is just discovering some sports you never normally watch, and you just get enthralled in it. Like, you start watching beach volleyball in front of the Eiffel Tower, and you're like, oh my God, this is so cool. Like, I just want to watch this stuff. That's the great thing about the Olympics is once someone puts the jersey on, they'll become invested in it. And you don't have to be any kind of team handball aficionado or fencing aficionado. Once you see the countries on someone's vest or jersey, you're just into it because you have a connection with that person being from that country.
Along with the attractions of these interesting sports that you don't get a chance to see normally, there's also just simply a lot more events. Breakdancing is going to be a competitive sport at the Paris Olympics. Is it no longer possible for an American broadcast network to offer the Olympics simply as a broadcast product? Do you have to splay it across 3 or 4 different program streams just to capture the tremendous range of what's being offered?
First of all, I love just the fact that, like, as a kid in the late 80s and early 90s, seeing people breakdancing in New York City, now that that's an Olympic sport, to me, it just blows my mind, which is great. Yes, the Olympics today cannot just be a broadcast product. The world has changed. Peacock will offer every event live on streaming. It's a very big business proposition for them in that they hope to get 7 figures worth of signups during the Olympics. And then you hope that the churn rate is not so great and that people will stick around. In terms of your breakdancing example is an interesting one because the IOC, they realized probably about a decade ago that they have to get younger. Like they have to get their viewership younger. They have to get interest younger. And so they have made certain decisions to bring in sports that they believe can attract younger people. Things like Snowboard X, where competitors compete against each other, almost like a track and field race, down a mountain on a snowboard. That's very exciting to watch. And you can understand why young people would sort of be into that. It's the same reason why you're going to see in Los Angeles football for the first time, not tackle football, but flag football. And that's a way to get the Olympics hopes the NFL involved. The Olympics now has 3-on-3 basketball in addition to the traditional basketball that we watch. The reason for that, 3-on-3 is much faster. It's only half court. It's a pretty good television sport. You can sort of follow it. So the Olympics has changed, and it's had to change. And then to sort of get back to where you asked your question, part of that change too is just how they broadcast all this stuff. You have to basically appeal to younger people. So you have to put all this stuff on as many different screens as possible. And then NBC also has much more of a social media presence. They've brought in influencers who are going to Paris on their behalf to TikTok the games, to put stuff on Instagram, to put stuff on Threads, Twitter, etc. So, NBC understands this as well, that the way for their product to survive long term, they have to try to get as many under 30-year-olds interested in this. And generally speaking, the way to have any shot of getting them interested in it is probably to go through social media means and to probably condense this stuff. They're not going to watch 2 hours like me and you will, Ray, but maybe they'll watch a 5-minute highlight. And you can then sell advertising off that 5-minute highlight.
Has nationalism declined to a degree in the games now that there are so many athletes who play for countries or wear the jersey of countries they weren't born in and didn't grow up in? You see a lot of African-born Swiss runners and Danish runners, and even now from the Arabian Peninsula, where those countries have a lot of money and not a lot of people, they have complete Olympic teams that feature people born all over the world. Can we now look at this not so much as country against country, but really sort of individuals who are flying flags of convenience in a lot of ways?
Yeah, maybe. It's an interesting question. This comes up in soccer as well many times when someone can sort of declare what national team they want to play for. And then obviously you see some people play for certain teams in the World Cup. I still have of the belief that once the competition starts and once that person is wearing said country's flag or jersey on their whatever their uniform is, I think people generally get behind that person. Nationalism, I would say globally, is on the rise. Populism is on the rise. By the way, there's a lot of danger with all this stuff if you're just going to be real about it. But there is a rise of people who want to get behind said respective flag. It'll be interesting to see, at least especially in the States. We have had some national teams where there are some groups of people who will actively, at least on social media, maybe not cheer for someone for their own country because maybe they don't share their political beliefs or their social beliefs. But I have found, at least historically, people do put all this stuff aside to root for their country, to root for their flag. And if I had to guess, I think you will see Americans in particular watching all this stuff and being really excited if Americans do well on the medal stand.
It occurs to me because I've been watching a lot of track and field. Wonderful thing about streaming services is you can watch particular sports sort of out of the Olympic cycle. And there are, in let's say, short distance running, everybody who lines up on the start line lives and trains in the United States and goes to an American university. And they are nominally from Barbados and Jamaica and Trinidad. And the commentators will say, and Jane runs track for the University of Oregon, because that's one of the great centers of running-based sports. There's also a refugee team, or has been in some Olympics, people who can no longer play for their country but are world-class athletes. So the role of nationalism, I guess, is what's being renegotiated right now.
A lot of countries sort of do an athlete shop because there's real public relations value, if you want to call it propaganda value, but there's real value in having people who win medals for your country. And so the fact that the U.S. colleges are a repository for great athletes around the world is no surprise. I mean, the reality is that gives you probably the best chance to have a professional career, gives you the best chance for opportunities. But people should always remember that there's nothing pure about the Olympic Games. I mean, it's a commercial enterprise, and the people who run it have a horrific history just in terms of human rights and looking the other way on ills. I mean, they've catered to dictators. They've catered to mass murderers. You can't be naive about it. What always saves the games, though, this I have always, when I worked at Sports Illustrated, I used to have a couple of the writers who covered these games with me. We'd always sort of agree on the same thing. Is like, for all the bleep that comes with the Olympics, the athletes almost always save the games because there is some kind of great moment or moments where you come away from those Olympics and you're like, I'm so glad I was part of this. In Sydney is like Kathy Freeman's historic sort of run, like one of the most incredible moments in history. If you're just going to be honest, you know that in many ways it's corrupt. It's a total boondoggle for certain groups. Yes, there's doping and all this stuff going on, but like, you get these moments, right? You then can tell your friends the next day, holy cow, did you see that like volleyball match when the US came back and beat Cuba? The athletes in the end save the games. They always do. And I would expect that to be the case. Even if things sort of bubble up in Paris that are not particularly pleasant, the athletes will end up saving those games as well.
As somebody who came up during the intense Cold War Olympic Games, where the United States, in part because of the overwhelming influence of Avery Brundage, who was then the head of the U.S. Olympic Committee, very strictly hewed to our athletes or amateurs line, while we knew that in the Eastern Bloc, basically, hockey players just played hockey and basketball players just played basketball and runners just ran. They might have nominally been in the Army or civil servants or something. But we had, at those times, national fund drives to give money to various Olympic teams to send them to wherever the next Olympiad was. And we also had corporate sponsors who made much of the fact that during the off season, they employed these people in various kinds of stores or warehouses and gave them time to train. That part of it is gone. It's dead. You come off the Diamond League. You come off of a year of running and training. You are a professional athlete in just about every sport. We're watching the best athletes in the world rather than the best amateur athletes in the world. Did it turn out to make a difference? Did anybody care?
No, I don't think anybody cared. I think we're much more honest now of the professionalism of all this. And in every major sport, these are all professionals. You're 100% right. They have sponsors. They're funded. Where the amateurism, at least in my opinion, still exists would be these non-revenue sports. If you are an Olympic kayaker, okay, or if you're like an Olympic rower, to me, you're an amateur. Hopefully you're getting funding from the USOC or wherever, but by and large, you're not Noah Lyles. You're not these runners who run in the Diamond League and can win $100,000, $200,000 or more per meet. You're probably working a couple of jobs just to maintain your ability as an Olympian. So in some ways, the Olympics, it's a mix of mostly pros, but some people who would still fall under amateurism. But the whole thing is a pro show. NBC's not paying billions of dollars for no reason. They're doing it because this is a commercial enterprise that they're trying to make money off of. They're selling patriotism at the end of the day. I have such respect for the people who are in these non-revenue sports because they're really doing it for the love of their sport. Like, there's no rainbow at the end of this for the most part. I mean, maybe you get lucky and you're in some sport like cross-country skiing and you do something so amazing and NBC highlights it, and then you might get some sponsors from this incredible achievement. But for the most part, you just go, you compete, you do your race, and then you go back to regular lives. You're not going back to the NBA. You're not going back to the WNBA. So there are in some ways two different Olympics, but by and large, the sports that will draw the most attention for the American public, they're essentially pros. I don't look at them any differently than I look at an NFL player.
Back in February, you wrote an article for The Athletic. Can NBC and the Olympics get their TV ratings groove back in Paris? And you quoted Bob Costas, probably one of the best-known sports commentators of modern broadcasting. And he says, I see Paris as a chance for the Olympics to get its mojo back. February feels like a long time ago. There was no French election. There was no distracting American election yet. There weren't people threatening to take a dump in the Seine so that there's raw sewage when athletes come by in various water events. Is it still possible to buy into Bob Costas's optimism about the Paris Games.
Yeah, I still buy in. I buy in with some realism. Obviously, no one could have imagined that the Olympics will be debuting straight off one of the most dramatic elections in French history. There's always something that happens prior to the games when it comes to sort of venues or something that just is not going well. So we'll see what happens with the Seine. Obviously, I would hope that those who are running these swimming events, if it's not safe for the athletes, you can't do it. You just take the hit and you figure something else out. But I really do think that the reason why I subscribe to what Costa said, honestly, is because of the city of Paris. It's the first time in a long time that Americans are getting able to watch a city that sort of has this idealism to it in terms of how Americans see it. Like the idealism of, this is one of the world's beautiful cities. If I could ever go abroad, I'd want to see this. They have the Eiffel Tower, like one of the most famous modern structures that exists in civilization. Like it's very easily identifiable. It's not the sober, kind of cold Olympics that Beijing brought in the Winter Games. And then listen, Tokyo is obviously an amazing city, but the Japanese could not put on a real Olympics. I mean, it's in the middle of COVID. You got people walking around with masks. There's no crowds. That was an impossible Olympics. So yeah, we haven't had a real Olympics, or at least what Americans think of as a real Olympics, in a long time. And I'm not sure you could pick a better city for it outside of just hosting it in your own country. Again, if I was at the Vegas tables, I would still bet over on Paris. I don't think it'll be perfect, but I think Americans are going to be really interested in these Olympics. And maybe for some of the things you said, Ray, maybe this provides a distraction for people just away from the day-to-day endless sort of cycle of politics and sort of dour headlines. It feels a little bit nice to sit in front of a television at 7, 8 o'clock at night and just sort of take your mind off this stuff and watch some great athletes.
And when it's all over, when the flame is doused in the cauldron and they sing the Marseillaise and the Star-Spangled Banner and the torch is handed on to the U.S. Olympic Committee, listen to Sports Media with Richard Deitsch because you'll get a summation. Richard, thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Great conversation, Ray. Thank you.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jarrett Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.